Welcome to this IRPP webinar on Canada's patent strategy and the knowledge economy. This webinar was made possible in part by the support of Admire Bioinnovation. Admire Bioinnovation is a single-stop destination with the necessary scientific, business, infrastructure, and capital resources to enable companies to successfully advance their health-related technology pipeline. Admire Bioinnovation is proud to be helping Canadian companies scale up. Learn more at admirebio.com. And I'll leave you with the moderator of today's event and Vice President of Research at the IRPP, France St-Hilaire. Bienvenue à notre webinaire qui a été commandité par Admire Bioinnovation. Je tiens à vous rappeler que les présentations seront uniquement en anglais. Je cède maintenant la parole à la modératrice France St-Hilaire, vice-présidente à la recherche à l'IRPP.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking this time to be with us for this webinar this afternoon. Today's presentation is based on an IRPP study that was published in August as part of our innovation research program. The objective of that research program is to improve our understanding of the innovation process in the Canadian economy, and in particular, the demand for innovation and the role of government in facilitating this demand. In their paper, Gallini and Aidan Hollis provide an important explanation for the disconnect between Canada's innovation promise, as reflected in its strong research institution and highly skilled workforce, and its modest record on patents and IP development. As they point out, patent ownership is key for innovators, especially SMEs, looking to commercialize and invent their inventions and scale up. Better understanding the dynamics at play in this process is therefore essential for policymakers looking to improve Canada's performance in this regard. Our presenters are Gallini and Aidan Hollis. Nancy is Professor Emeritus at the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia. Her research focuses on the economics of intellectual property, technology licensing, and competition policy. Aidan is Professor of Economics at the University of Calgary. His research focuses on innovation and competition in the pharmaceutical and electricity markets. Their presentation is expected to take about 25 minutes, so this will leave us ample time to take questions and have discussion. So I would ask you, in the interest of time, to please make sure that your questions are succinct and direct. And without further ado, we'll begin with Nancy, I believe.
Thank you so much, France, and thanks especially to all of you, the participants, for joining us today. Now, Aidan and I would like to discuss with you today an issue that has concerned policymakers in Canada and has been the focus of several recent studies on innovation in Canada. And that concern is that, next slide please, Canadian SMEs, small and medium enterprises, tend to sell their assets, and namely their intellectual property, to foreign entities rather than scale up and commercialize their innovations. So in other words, Canadians seem to be rather good at inventing, but tend to sell or assign their property rights rather than retain them and progress on to the next stages of innovation, growth, and commercialization. And so toward getting a better sense of this issue, Aidan and I are going to address three questions. So the first question is, what is the evidence of this concern that Canadian IP is being sold to foreign entities? And by the way, we will be referring to intellectual property as IP throughout this presentation. And the second question is, why is this occurring? And should this be a policy concern in Canada? And the third question is, what policies might incentivize efficient retention and commercialization of Canadian invented IP? Now, our focus here is on patents, although we do recognize that many innovations are not protected by patents. For example, Canadian inventors may find that trade secrets are actually a better way to protect process inventions because they do not require disclosure of information as patents do. And of course, trade secrets too may flow to foreign entities and deserve further study, but we just don't do that here. So with that brief introduction, I will turn it over to Aidan, who will address the first question.
Great, so let me start by addressing the question, well, what is the evidence that Canadian patents are being transferred to foreign owners? So our evidence is based on patents issued in the United States. And we focus on the US market because Canadian residents patent much more in the US than in any other country, including Canada. It is the most important market for patenting. And using patents issued in the US also enables us to compare on a level playing field with other countries that patent in the US market. So this graph shows the trend in patents granted, where the research team included at least one Canadian inventor. For short, we'll call these Canadian invented patents. We can see a steady increase in the number of Canadian invented patents over time, which certainly seems like a positive. Unfortunately, a lot of Canadian invented patents are assigned away immediately to a foreign company. The green curve shows the patents that remain with Canadian residents, either with the original inventor or assigned to another Canadian resident, where Canadian residents also include Canadian subsidiaries of foreign companies. You should note that in 2017, approximately 45% of Canadian invented patents were assigned immediately to foreign entities. Now, on the other hand, Canada does get assigned a small number of US patents on inventions that had been invented only by foreign innovators, and that's represented by the small upward shift of the red curve. The obvious point here is that we're seeing lots of patented invention by Canadians, but a large share of those patents are ultimately exploited by foreign corporations, and that share seems to be increasing. So the way we think of this is that Canada has a net loss of intellectual property. It seems that we transfer more of our inventions to other countries than they do to us. Note also that this deficit has really increased dramatically over the past 20 years. We think of the blue curve as representing Canada's inventive capacity, while the red curve represents Canada's kind of scale up capacity, where scale up reflects the ability to commercialize and fully exploit a patented invention. So we're going to explain why this loss of patents may be problematic based on results in the economics literature, as well as why the net loss of intellectual property has increased so much recently. Now, just as an extra point, the curves in this graph show assignments that happened immediately upon the issuance of the patent. However, it turns out that if you track what happens to patents over time, there are even more assignments. We found that almost 60% of Canadian invented US patents were ultimately assigned to foreign owners after allowing a few years to pass. So we then asked, how typical is the Canadian performance among other small open economies? So we checked this by considering a sample of 12 countries similar to Canada based on population and income, and also including the US for the years 2013 to 2017. And as you can see here, the blue bars are cumulative patents invented by country residents. The red ones are the patents assigned to that country's residents. So Canada's in the middle of the pack. Starts off at 7 with invention, then falls to 8 in ownership, which seems okay. But while the ranking from invention to ownership doesn't fall significantly, the results become much more dramatic when we look at the magnitude of the difference between invention and ownership, that is the IP deficit. Now here at the bottom graph, what we see is Canada is what you could call an IP deficit leader, ranking only second in the amount assigned or sold away, net of what we get back. So this seems like a significant issue for Canada. And I'll now turn back to Nancy to address the second question.
Okay, so why is this occurring? What are the incentives to sell versus scale up? Now, there are several reasons that have been given why firms might sell their assets rather than move on to the next stage of development. For example, this one here by the Council of Canadian Academies said that lack of managerial experience and IP skills in Canada that are required to guide technology firms as they expand into global markets is an important reason. But another reason may simply be that Canadian inventors are employees of foreign firms, including subsidiaries, and are required by contract to assign IP that they develop to their employers. And so in this case, we might think more of Canadians selling their labor rather than selling their IP assets. But we suggest another reason that is motivated by the economic literature, that has to do with the international patent system itself, especially in the United States. And this reason begins with the premise that firms will have a greater incentive to grow and commercialize if they have access to large global markets, and therefore they will need patents in those markets. But the literature tells us that obtaining, maintaining, and defending international patent rights can make scaling up and operating in global markets simply too costly. So let's just get a sense of what these costs might be. The Committee for Economic Development estimates that to obtain and maintain a patent in the US can run $50,000 to $100,000. And add on to those costs, the cost of litigation, litigating challenges of infringement and so on, the bill quickly escalates to the millions. So you may wonder, why are the costs of patenting in the US so high? Well, that answer can be traced to policy changes in the global patent systems, and again, particularly in the United States, since the 1980s. So the main changes in the US included expansion of subject matter to genetic materials, software, and business methods. And this change, clearly increased incentives to patent more. The second change was the creation of the centralized Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And this court now hears all the patent appeal cases for the entire country. Research has indicated that this court has become pro-patent in that patent owners were more likely to win legal battles involving infringement or validity of their patents. And this clearly increased the incentive to litigate. And then a third change was the adoption of TRIPS, which was an international agreement that required all WTO members, including very poor countries, to adopt patent systems more closely in line with those of developed countries. So what did these changes give us? Well, as you'd expect, they gave us more patents and more litigation. So as shown here, there was an abrupt increase in litigation cases per patents granted around the 1980s when these policies changed. And since then, litigation has more or less kept pace with patent grants, which also have been increasing over time. Now, many economists believe that this explosion in patents and litigation has created a chilling effect on innovation. And this is due to the cumulative and sequential nature of the innovation process. And by this, we mean that new discoveries typically use and improve, and they build upon previous generations of discoveries. And so if those earlier discoveries are protected by patents, then further innovation in those areas could be blocked, or at best be very costly. So this cumulative and sequential process describes most modern technologies, especially those that are modular. That is, they're technologies that are made up of many distinct and interchangeable components. So for example, here's a modular invention that requires 3 components. But in reality, information and communication technologies, ICT, and consumer electronics, typically hundreds or sometimes thousands of components may be needed. And so if patents on those components are owned by a lot of different firms, then any innovator hoping to use those components to make new products would have to negotiate multiple contracts with multiple firms and pay multiple royalties. And this can be very costly. But the alternatives are also not so great. The innovators could just ignore the patents and risk being sued for infringement, or they could sell their IP and abandon research in that area altogether. So in short, what we have here is a problem that there are simply too many owners of property rights on IP that are needed to do further innovation, scale up, and commercialization. This is called the AntiCommons problem in economics. And here we see an example of smartphones, which is the textbook case of AntiCommons. It's a picture of disassembled hardware components of smartphones, and many of those are protected by patents, and add on to those all the software involved in a smartphone. According to a study, close to 250,000 active patents in the United States impact smartphones, which makes us one of the most litigious high-tech industries. So to summarize then, the high cost of obtaining, maintaining, and defending patents in global markets, at least in theory, may compel firms to simply sell their IP and forego further development on that innovation. But now we want to ask, just how relevant is this theory to the Canadian situation? Is there any evidence that the cost of the US patent regime has been a factor in the Canadian sell versus scale up decision? And if so, what does it say about the importance of patent ownership for Canadian innovators? Well, answers to those questions can be found in several papers that estimate the impact of patents on incentives to innovate. And the most relevant are by two economists, Galasso and Shankerman. They consider the case in which firms are engaged in follow-on innovation that build on existing inventions, as we just were discussing. And the authors ask whether patents on those required inventions tend to impede or maybe facilitate follow-on innovation. Their analysis was conducted with US firm data, but the results are actually do provide important insights into the Canadian situation. Now, their first finding from the literature, from this literature, is that firms may be less inclined to engage in follow-on innovation, and for our purposes, you can call that scale-up innovation, if they are small firms and the innovation they are working on requires patents that are owned by other firms that turn out to be large. So small firms needing patents from large firms. And they did not find any other combination of firms to be significant in this regard, for innovation to be significantly affected. Now, this finding is clearly relevant to Canada, as small, medium enterprises are vital contributors to Canada's innovation landscape. And in fact, accounted for more than 50% of the value of Canada's output during 2002 and 2014. Now, a second finding is that follow-on innovation is negatively impacted in technology areas that require a lot of inputs that suffer from the AntiCommons problem, such as ICT and consumer electronics. This is also relevant to Canada, as according to the 2018 Council of Canadian Academy Studies, ICT is among one of the areas of Canada's R&D strengths. Now, these results indicate that patents owned by others can be problematic for Canadian SMEs trying to scale up and commercialize. But the flip side suggests that it would actually be wise for SMEs to hang on to their early stage patents if they plan to work in that same or related areas. Otherwise, they could end up finding themselves paying massive royalty rates later on for technologies that they actually developed. And this was a point that has been highlighted by James Hinton and others. Now, a third result from these studies is that SMEs will be, or small medium enterprises, will be more inclined to engage in follow-on research if they are the owners of the required patents, especially if those patents turn out to be in their core area that they're doing research in and can be used as collateral for securing financial capital. So to sum up, the economics literature offers useful insights as to why the cost of operating in global markets, particularly in the US, may compel Canadian SMEs to sell their IP rather than scale up. But it also provides evidence that retaining patent ownership in core areas of research can maybe help reduce some of those costs and avoid high royalties in the future in those areas, and increase their ability to progress along the stages of innovation to commercialization. And it's in this sense that we consider patent ownership to be an important component of Canada's scale-up capacity. So that brings us to the third and the last question. What policies can facilitate efficient retention of Canadian invented IP. So we begin with the National IP Strategy, which is a recently introduced policy initiative by the federal government, and it aims to help Canadian businesses, creators, entrepreneurs, and innovators understand, protect, and access intellectual property. Now, it's similar to what we've been discussing earlier today, that it's based on the view that to give Canadian firms incentive to grow, they need access to global markets. And IP protection is central to this. So the federal government has allocated $85 million over 5 years to 3 activities under this national IP strategy. The first is IP education and awareness. And this component is going to fund mostly university-based clinics that will provide legal advice and economic advice on the value of patents and also strategies for navigating international IP systems. And a second is going to involve legislative changes that will prohibit patent trolls from threatening, firms, unsuspecting firms with lawsuits unless they pay those trolls very large penalties. And the third, and I consider this to be quite an innovative initiative, is the Patent Collective. And 30 million of the 85 million will be allocated to this collective. Now, so far, little information on the collective is available, but to get an idea of what it's intended to do, recall this diagram of an invention that required multiple essential patents. The Patent Collective is effectively going to collect all those essential patents under a single administrative unit, as shown here by the circle. And it makes them available to members at reasonable rates. So what we know thus far is that there actually is going to be a new nonprofit called the Innovation Asset Collective that is going to be responsible for purchasing and administering essential patents. The focus is going to be on clean technologies, and the members are going to tend to be SMEs. A recent Globe and Mail headline was quite interesting because it read, quote, "Canada's new IP collective is a win for Canada's scaling companies." Now, these are very early days of the collective, and so the effectiveness of this initiative remains to be seen. But if it is organized well, it does have the potential of mitigating some of those risks of litigation and cost of operating in clean technology markets. Now, overall, the amount allocated to this national IP strategy is really modest, but it's a start. And it should be closely monitored over these next 5 years, and where it's successful, expanded upon. But to be honest, it is not going to suddenly incentivize Canadian SMEs to scale up and commercialize their innovations. We're going to need a greater array of complementary policies for this to happen. And so Aidan's going to talk briefly about what those policies might look like before concluding our presentation. Over to you, Aidan.
Great, thanks, Nancy. So I'll start with one thing that probably shouldn't be a policy focus. Some have suggested that strengthening Canada's patent system in some way could help, but we've really not found compelling evidence that strengthening Canada's patent system would enhance innovators' incentives to scale up, since Canada's a relatively small market, and so the incentives for scaling up fundamentally depend on the ability to obtain and retain ownership of international patents and compete in those markets. Now, some observers have proposed taxing the sale of patents to foreign entities. We don't think that's a good idea, and we suspect it would be counterproductive for research activity in Canada for a number of reasons. Perhaps there could be a tool or a requirement that repayments should be made if a technology that receives substantial government funding was assigned or transferred to a foreign entity. But as suggested in the CCA report, not everything is lost just because a patent is sold. It really depends on where the R&D and the operations are located. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of merit in allowing patentees to use their own information to decide when is the profit maximizing time and way to sell a patent. Rather, we think that the right strategy is to provide an environment that provides positive incentives to scale up rather than penalizing the sale of patents. Regarding foreign subsidiaries, although they do own the patent, they are also providing entrepreneurial training that may be valuable for employees moving into other innovation sectors in Canada. However, innovators may need support in identifying the value of their innovations so that they receive a fair return. For example, an innovation in advanced material might have a large number of uses in sectors such as aerospace, automotive, consumer electronics, that might not be anticipated by a small innovator in the advanced material sector, but could be by large buyers. That is, a large firm may have an asymmetric information advantage that could be mitigated with government legal and economic support. Another set of policies that we think do deserve closer examination is federal and provincial funding to research. So as you can see here, Canada is in the middle of the group in terms of total federal government funding and could step up its game in this regard. But what we found, albeit with a very limited sample, is that what might matter more is the mix of funding of direct versus indirect. So and direct funding essentially means choosing to sponsor a particular innovative process, whereas indirect would be through tax credits. And we found that for our sample of countries, there's a positive and significant correlation between direct funding to business as a share of GDP and total patents per GDP, but only a small and statistically insignificant relationship between total government funding and patents per GDP. And just generally, we see in this graph that direct funding seems to drive more innovation than tax credits. And generally, we think that the mix of funding deserves further attention. So in conclusion, the message here is that recent attention on how to support innovators' intellectual property rights as they attempt to scale up is encouraging. Of course, in some cases, there's an effort to make research progress without patents. For example, the innovative open science project at McGill advocates the sharing of knowledge rather than protecting it through proprietary rights to avoid wasteful parallel research and increase the flow of knowledge and innovation. And the Structural Genome Project and its offshoot M4K Pharma in Toronto is another promising example of where patents are being used and in unusual ways that don't restrict imitation. But in many cases, retaining patents, not for their own sake, but as a strategic tool for accessing global markets or limiting other firms from using them as blocking devices, will be valuable. And so ensuring that policies do not force the issue, but are designed to reduce the market failures and barriers of operating in global markets could help to tip the sell versus scale up balance towards retaining ownership for growth and improve Canada's economic prospects. But again, let's be clear, dealing with the patent ownership issue will probably not turn Canada into an innovation superpower overnight, but a wider set of policies to support invention and patent retention could help it in advancing the country. So thank you very much for your attention. And we are looking forward to your comments, questions, and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Aidan. We have a few questions, and I encourage our participants to send in more. I'll start with one of them. This participant has read the study and is wondering if you could elaborate on how we can prevent the early sell-off of patent rights in the AI sector.
Aidan, do you want to take that one?
I don't know about exactly how this would apply to the AI sector specifically, but it's clear that a large fraction of patents are being assigned in part because of foreign ownership of companies that are operating subsidiaries in Canada. So we are going to see that inevitably. And it's clear that there needs to be a focus on supporting innovative companies to be able to scale up as quickly as possible, since we know that this is an area which is going to get a lot of attention from other countries, particularly China and the US.
Yeah, I'll add to that. This is clearly an area that is of great interest in Canada. We've received some notices from other people who are working in the sector and wanted some elaboration. There are several groups, teams throughout Canada working in AI and robotics. And one thing that we have found, again, using a random sample, and others have found, that the greater the number of Canadians on the research team, the more likely that the patents will stay in Canada. Now, that's a correlation. That isn't any kind of a causality, but others have also shown that Canadian input into patents has a increasing effect on value of those patents. And so given that the government is focusing this, putting funding towards AI, that there are teams at different universities and institutes. I know there's a group at UBC, and there's some certainly on the East Coast in Toronto and Montreal. And the more Canadians involved in this team, at least it correlates with those patents staying in Canada. But I think what is also important is what the national IP strategy is at least trying to do. And that is to alert these researchers, to educate these researchers as to the importance of patents for small open economy researchers to hold on to patents to be able to navigate global markets. And so I think at least in principle, whether or not it's going to actually work, the intentions behind the national IP strategy, I think, are very good.
Thank you, Nancy. We have one participant here that observed that Canadian invented patents obviously increased after 2004, and they're wondering if you have an explanation for that particular change.
So one of the possible reasons for the increase in invention by Canadians is an increase in the scale of teams that are listed on patents. So as the number of individuals who are listed on patents increases, there's a higher probability of a Canadian being on the team. So it is possible that some of the effect that we're seeing there is from an increase in the number of inventors listed on patents. That's something that we have yet to investigate. But I think generally the increase in the number of Canadian invented patents is consistent with the change that we're seeing in the number of patents overall.
Why 2004 was significant is hard to say. Whether or not there was an increase in funding maybe during that period, but that's that particular year is probably harder to explain.
Thank you. We have a couple questions about universities. What about our universities? What can be done to retain IP that is produced through our public institutions?
That's a very interesting question. One study that would be useful, and I think there is a student who is working on this, is comparing the different kinds of IP strategies across Canadian universities. It's really very different. UBC, for example, provides non-exclusive licenses for its inventors. Waterloo, for example, gives the rights to the inventor. Others have sharing agreements. And it would be interesting to understand what impact those regimes, those different kinds of IP policies within the universities have in encouraging scientists to actually do innovation. But the question is on retention. And that's a bit tricky. As you know, there is this, in the United States, there was the Bayh-Dole Act, which effectively allowed any innovations that were developed through public funds to be retained at the university, which then led to these large technology transfer offices throughout U.S. universities, and also now in Canada. But there often is a tendency for the universities, if they decide to go ahead with a patent on a particular invention, to maybe just let the private sector take the patent. And so if we want the universities, first of all, if we want the universities to continue holding on to the patent, it's going to involve some complicated contractual arrangements with the private sector partners, because much of the research is being conducted with the private sector. And that's very tricky, because often it's just easier to give the patent away to the private sector. So those contracts are going to have to be very thoughtful and negotiated. And I think also, again, going back to the national IP strategy, this idea of having these IP clinics that not only inform scientists of the importance of intellectual property, but actually inform the technology transfer offices of ways to keep the intellectual property, how to navigate international global markets as well, could be very, very useful. And I will point out that as far as we understand, many of those clinics have been funded in the East Coast, but we've yet to see any of those clinics develop in the West Coast. And there's a lot of innovation that's taking place in BC and Alberta. So, so I think that those could actually have a big impact in educating universities on how important it is to keep the intellectual property.
Thanks,
yeah, that's the first time I've ever heard Alberta described as being on the West Coast. Anyway, let me just add to this that there was a very interesting industry committee study in Parliament a year or two ago, which is certainly worth reading. I also point out that the universities have quite different policies about how to exploit inventions which come out of our public universities. So some universities basically just hand over the rights to the invention entirely to the inventor, and some of them retain some fractional share. And it'd be interesting to see how those two different policies actually play out in terms of the success of those policies.
Yeah, and other participants wonder which sectors are more prone to selling their IP early in the process.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Again, this is the paper. And by the way, thank you to the different participants who actually read the paper. That's very kind of you. We did do some sectoral analysis, and I'm really cautious about those because those results are really more illustrative than anything else, because it really depends on which categories you use to define, for example, ICT or artificial intelligence and so on. But using the analysis that we did and doing just a rough estimate, it was quite interesting that the sectors that tended to sell off, and again, we say that sell off cautiously because in many cases it's the inventor is the employee of the foreign company, but the sectors where you saw a higher percentage of Canadian invented patents going to foreign entities were in ICT, nanotechnology, and artificial intelligence during the years we looked at, which were, I think it was 2013 to 2017. And those that tended to be below average in terms of selling off to foreign entities were the pharmaceutical and aeronautics. Now, what's interesting about that are the three that tend to sell off above the average are also coincide with the AntiCommons problem that we talked about earlier. It's also those industries that are modular requiring, or technologies that are modular requiring a lot of components. And those also tend to be the ones that sell off. Now, again, correlation, not a causality, but it certainly would be an interesting thing to look at more deeply.
Aidan, anything to add?
I believe that actually in the oil and gas sector, which is a substantial patenter in Canada now, a lot of those are actually retained in Canada. Not surprisingly, for heavy oil and the oil sands, those patents are naturally going to stay here, since that's where they can be used.
Right.
Next question. Your data showed that Israel and the UK as being significant exporters of patents. Did you look at those countries in comparison to Canada? Is the loss of IP also perceived as an economic challenge barrier to innovation there? Are they taking similar steps to encourage retention of patents by domestic firms?
So in the case of Israel, which is a very successful export of intellectual property, one of the things you see is that they just have an enormous number of US issued patents per capita. They're easily the leader in the group of countries that we looked at. And because of that, I think essentially the export of patents isn't such a concern. They're still left with a very large number. And as for the UK, I'm not so sure, since their market is more naturally connected with Europe.
Right. I'm just looking at the paper now in terms of the UK's tax to indirect versus direct funding. And the UK was, let's see, they were quite similar to the Canadian situation, right? I believe in terms of using indirect incentives to direct incentives.
I think the question was about the loss of patents.
Yeah, it is. It is a loss of patents.
Deficit.
Right, right. It definitely was. But on the other hand, in terms of the kind of funding that is provided, could also, if it is, how shall we say, if the direct funding is toward creating large teams in those countries that are more likely to retain their patents, there could be that impact on retention as well. But I will say that these are great questions, and they are identifying some important research papers that should be done. Maybe the IRPP should take these on. Doing a cross-sectional study of the different countries would be incredibly useful. And we did that at a very small scale, in which we did compare direct versus indirect policies. And again, just really document the comparison between Canada and other countries in terms of selling off technologies. And as we talked about earlier, we're more or less in the middle of the pack of the 12 countries that we looked at. But definitely an important topic to review further.
So there's one participant that wonders if the pattern is consistent across the country, or if there's some provinces or cities where the selling of patents is more probable or more acute, if you like.
That is an interesting question. Aidan, do you know the answer to
No,
that?
we didn't try to investigate geographic specificity and the location of patents within Canada, since the US data that we focused on actually really lists the location of the individual as a country, not within Canada specifically.
So it would be quite labor intensive to go back, because typically they do, as Aidan said, we'll have the country, but and again, keep in mind, we are only looking at US patents at this point because of the importance of the US market. But they would give a province as well, I think. So it would be possible to go back. It would take a while, but it's a very interesting question to be considering. And not only which provinces do it, but in what sectors would these sell-offs tend to take place.
Someone is wondering what are the key components of a patent collective? any, you know, any lessons from other countries that we could learn?
Yes, there are 3 others that have been tried, one in Japan, one in South Korea, and one in France. And typically the components, there are different objectives that each of these have done. Several papers by James Hinton and co-authors have looked at this. And one is, do you form the patent for defensive purposes? So in other words, to help the members of the collective defend their patents if they're accused of infringement or maybe invalidity of their patents. Another one is to help provide sort of finance to help them commercialize, to scale up and that sort of thing. So that's another purpose, to share information as to how to go about doing this, which is a third important one, which is education. And that is to, you know, like I said, share information, get legal advice and so on, how to navigate the markets. And these 3 have been moderately successful. It appears that almost all 3 of them have focused on the defensive part, have really tried to help the members defend their patents, and also on helping them scale up. But it's, and in some cases, it looked like it was what Aidan talked about earlier. We don't want these patents to be retained just for the sake of retaining. We want to make sure it's efficient, that it makes sense to retain, because maybe it actually does make sense to sell the patent and get some, you know, a market return on it, and then invest that money into other kinds of projects. So just saving for our retaining for the sake of retaining is not necessarily a good idea, but you do see a difference among the collectives, those 3 collectives, as to the percentage of patents that were Korean or Japanese or French, and whether or not they're US held patents. So, you know, but I think the most of them have worried about helping the members defend and helping the members scale up.
Yeah. Aidan, did you want to add something, or?
No, I mean, I think the concern that I have about the patent collective is the size of the budget. At $30 million over 5 years isn't, it seems necessarily going to be enough to support the quite ambitious goal that I think the collective has, and that we would want to see in terms of the ability to actually put together some patents.
Yeah.
Yes, Nancy?
Well, I'm just going to say, but one good thing about it is that they are focused. They're focused on climate technology, on clean technologies, which I think is good. I think there's some tricky questions, though, about which patents will be included, because if, you know, they need to be essential patents. They need to be the ones that the developers of clean technologies actually need, and that they're worried about being litigated against if they don't have access to. And so it's not clear where they're going to get those. Presumably they're going to get them from the members. And so then the question that we address, and I'm kind of cautious about something we say in the paper, which is whether or not foreign subsidiaries should be allowed to participate in these collective, in this collective. I think we suggest maybe so, but I do get a bit worried about that. Because if they do participate, well, first of all, if it's geared towards small, medium enterprises, maybe the foreign subsidiaries would be involved. But you know, I'm thinking that foreign subsidiaries may have access to some of the important patents that these firms are worried about. But on the other hand, if they get involved in the patent, what's going to be important is those patents that are available in Canada also become available in international jurisdictions as well. So we don't want the Canadian firm having access to these patents under, you know, CIPO, under the Canadian Intellectual Property Office, but then they go to the United States with their invention and they get sued because, you know, they don't have access to it in the United States. So it has to be that they have, international access as well. So it's going to be very, what Aidan said is he's concerned about the size of it. I think there's so many fundamental issues of how this is going to be organized. It's going to be really, really important. And going back to the earlier question, perhaps we can learn something from the three in Japan, South Korea, and France as well as to what they didn't do right that the Canadian one won't follow.
Right. So let me just mention that the France St-Hilaire, which is the French patent pool or patent collective, has a budget of around 20 million euros a year. So roughly 5 times the size.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Yeah, and so it's going to be a challenge, I think, for the small patent collective that's being proposed here to do everything that's hoped for.
Another aspect is competition policy. Do you think competition policy should play a role when large firms acquire small firms that could become potential competitors?
Yeah, that's something you're interested in, Aidan. So am I. But you might want to start with that one. That's really really interesting.
Yeah, under the Competition Act, it isn't likely that many of these small firms, which have only a relatively small market presence, are likely, probably you couldn't stop the invention, since the small firms whose patents are being acquired simply don't rise to the relevant thresholds. So while it would be maybe useful to think about that in some cases, I think in most of the cases that we're actually looking at, it's really impossible for the act to be used effectively.
Yeah, and I really like this question because I think it needs, well, I think it needs to be looked at carefully. There's the, Apple and Microsoft and Amazon, those are little tiny entities too at one point, the garage type of innovations that are technologies or firms that suddenly grew very, very large and became dominant. But as Aidan said, the current way that competition policy is organized, the percentage of sales in the market of a small firm is going to be too small to do anything about it. The question is, what is the potential? What is the potential competition? And there are a couple of papers I've seen recently, and in fact, one of our graduate students at UBC is very interested in this question as to whether or not the competition policy should apply to small high-tech firms that have the potential of growing and becoming a competitor. Because as of now, a lot of these small firms, they are providing various complementary inputs that the big vertically integrated firms want to buy. And the question is, could those small firms eventually become a large competitor? There was for a while a really interesting policy in the United States that also Canada adopted, and that is talking about innovation markets, not just final goods markets where prices are considered, or technology markets where there could be anti-competitive behavior in licensing contracts, but also looking at innovation markets. And that is a market in a kind of, in quotes, in which there are firms that have the assets to do future innovation. This was a policy that was adopted in the US when Rich Gilbert was the economist there, and it was, I think, around 2006. And it was, the whole idea was try to make some kind of guess or estimate as to the potential if you had, say, a merger between two innovating companies, even though they weren't competing with each other and and they were complementary, if they could turn out to dominate innovation in the future. Maybe we shouldn't allow those kinds of mergers. And so those, and what happened was the innovation market strategy kind of fell by the wayside with the change in government. But there's also some guidelines in Canada on the relationship between intellectual property and competition policy. The question is whether or not we need to resurrect that innovation policy, that concept of innovation markets, and see whether or not we can do make better estimates about the potential competition from firms that are highly innovative but don't meet, as Aidan said, that threshold for not allowing a merger to take place. Maybe there is still something there, and I think it's worth looking at.
There are other efficiency considerations. Of course, it may actually be better if the large firm acquires the technology from the small firm, right? Because it actually reduces inefficiencies in terms of assembling those technologies when you have a modular product. Then there's the issue that if the challenge is that the small firm is going to have to license a lot of technologies in order to scale up, then it's not really going to be a serious competitor in any case. So I think that competition policy is, for the most part, going to be too blunt an instrument to be able to solve this problem for us. Much more likely that we're going to need to use more direct methods to support Canadian innovation.
Well, that's spoken like a good economist. And those would be the considerations you would absolutely need to make. And that is why we also said, are there policies for efficient retention? We are not promoting that, as we said earlier, to retain just for the sake of it. Similarly here, you wouldn't use competition policy just for the sake of busting up, or breaking up these large firms, but want to make sure that this is efficiently done. So it's a very difficult problem, but I think it's an interesting area.
We only have a few minutes left, and there's lots of interesting questions coming in. This is actually from the ICED office in Toronto. So are you seeing this? Asking if you're seeing the same trends with regards to registering patents in China. We've heard that firms are being encouraged to register in China in addition to the US. Would be interested to know what fits in with your findings.
Oh, yes, we did not look at China. Absolutely not. But this is, I don't know, Aidan, do you have anything you want to say about this? Yeah.
No, it's clearly an important place to register patents, but we didn't look.
In fact, there's the measure of quality of patents, triadic patents, but they usually involve the United States, Europe, and Japan. But I think probably China is going to enter that mix in the near future.
Well, we can end with a very Canadian question. What lessons can be learned from the demise of Nortel, and what happened to its vast patent portfolio?
Well, so the demise of Nortel, I think the demise of Nortel and issues around research in motion, our RIM, have made Canada wonder, why don't we have more high-tech firms that can grow and sustain themselves? And I think one aspect of the innovation process is not only that you come up with an idea, develop it, scale up, commercialize, but you also are attuned to the market of, are there other uses for this product? Are there improvements we can make? And continue to grow from there. But I will also mention RIM, back in 2006, it was affected by a patent troll that accused it of infringing on this patent troll's patents, had to pay whatever it was, a $500 million or face the threat of an injunction. And so it went ahead and paid, and a few years later, that patent troll's patents were found to be invalid, or some of them were found to be invalid. So again, this goes toward trying to help small firms navigate these kinds of problems. So, Aidan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it turns out to be really difficult to build a world-beating company. And those very large firms are apparently struggling, especially in the high-tech area, to make their home in Canada. So it seems like maybe what we should be doing is focusing on a smaller scale and working our way up into essentially moderately sized companies that can capture a good share of the world market and essentially create value in that way.
Well, thank you both, Nancy and Aidan. It was a very interesting presentation, and with all the questions I'm seeing coming in, we could have a very much longer conversation. And I want to encourage all the participants to go and for those that have not done so, look at your paper on the IRPP website. And also want to keep a lookout for our next paper in this innovation series, which will be on the innovation superclusters coming out in the new year. So thank you again, and thank you to all the participants for your questions. And we encourage you to reply to our survey so that we can improve our ways of doing things here at the IRPP in terms of these webinars, which we hope are useful and interesting for all. And thank again to our sponsor, Admare Bioinnovation. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. And France, may I just say that if anyone is interested, we would be happy to take those extra questions offline if they would like. Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.